the way that all successful how can I put this? This is how Gandhi got independence for India. This is how Martin Luther King got the civil rights movement to work. So I got into this because 4 times in my life I have been involved with changing history, and I paid attention to how that happened. And then I started doing research on it, and I've been doing research on it for about 18 years. And the out of that research emerged a series of insights, I guess you could call them. I didn't invent these laws. What I did do was codify them, because these same dynamics kept appearing again and again in whenever I looked at successful social transformational movements.
So you've been involved in the civil rights movement, the consciousness movement. What were the other two?
Well, the 50s and 60s was the consciousness movement. The 70s was the transformation of the American military from an elitist conscription organization of the Vietnam era to the all-volunteer meritocracy that we have today. The 80s were citizen diplomacy, the idea that it was possible for ordinary people to create meaningful channels between supposed enemies, in this case the Soviet Union and the United States. And then through all of that, the consciousness movement and its first cousin, the ecology movement.
And how, in looking at the resistance to Trump that calls itself the resistance movement, how do you see the 8 laws playing out, being used effectively or not being used?
Well, the 8 laws, you can see them clearly in, for instance, Me Too is beginning to emerge in that format. For instance, let's go through the 8 laws, then it'll get much clearer.
Great.
So here are the 8 laws. The first one is the individual individually and the group collectively must share a common intention. Now, if you have ever been part of a committee at a school group or a church group or a neighborhood group, you know that it is not easy to get everybody on board a common intention.
Especially in left groups, people get into who's the most pure and who's not being pure and not being this enough or that enough.
Yes, exactly. I mean, you can see it in the Democratic Party all the time, is that it keeps fracturing because is this person purer than that person, exactly as you say. So the first law is you've got to share a common intention, and that is hard to do, as we just discussed. The second law is the individuals and the group may have goals but not have cherished outcomes. And by that I mean, for instance, in the case of civil rights, Martin Luther King had a goal, which was that race would not be a definer of inequality in public in public situations and in the government. That you know, black people would not be treated differently than white people. So you can have a goal, but you don't know how the goal is going to be achieved, because if it has to come in a blue box with a pink ribbon, you may miss the place where it could happen because you can't see it, because it's not coming in the package that you expect.
Right.
And that's another big one. that people don't get. You know, they have very strong ideas about how it's supposed to happen, and they miss the point, really.
Like they probably wouldn't have predicted that the backbone of the resistance movement is middle-class, white, suburban, soccer mom, PTA moms, that they're kind of the backbone of the resistance. I don't think that would have been predicted.
Yes or no, I cannot. Even as recently as the 2016 election, nobody anticipated that the new Congress that was elected in 2018, just 2 years later, would be filled with not only with women, but with women who had very different career paths than the usual white political guy.
Like restaurant worker, bartender.
Exactly. So you just don't know how it's going to happen. You have a goal that you're working for. And I actually learned this from the abolitionists, because if you read their diaries and the contemporary correspondence, they say things like, I am absolutely committed that slavery must end. I don't know how that's going to happen, but it's going to happen, and I'm going to do anything I can to make it happen.
And they probably wouldn't have predicted that a novel by Harriet Beecher Stowe would be so influential.
Precisely. That's a very good example of it, Gail. You have to be open to let the universe play its hand. So the third law is the individuals in the group must accept that their goal may not be reached in their lifetime and be okay with that. Because, again, I learned this from the abolitionists. You know, they would say things like, I don't know if slavery will end in my lifetime, but by God, I'm going to commit myself to ending it. Benjamin Franklin, for instance, when he died, was the president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. And he listed that as one of the things he was proudest of. Nobody would have predicted 30 years earlier that Benjamin Franklin would become a prominent abolitionist.
And so I think about women's suffrage. The first women's rights conference was 1848, and women didn't get the vote till 1919. So
18, but yes, exactly. That's the same thing. We're going to work on this thing, and we're not going to get discouraged. It's mainly the importance of that is that you don't get discouraged. You have something that is morally correct, that you know to be life-affirming and ethical, and you're going to pursue it.
Bill Maurer, the one who writes about social movements, says that it always happens that the third phase or whatever of his 5-stage phases is people get discouraged. They say, oh, it's over, feminism is over, abolitionism is over, whatever, because it didn't happen fast. So it happens a lot.
Yes.
Moyer.
Yeah.
Bill Moyer.
Bill Moyer. So you have to keep working at it, even though it's not going to happen, and you have to be okay with that.
That's hard.
Yeah, all of these are hard. They're not, when I got started doing this research, I wrote a book, as you know, called The 8 Laws of Change, in which all of this is discussed in this book. And when I began doing this research, as I say, about 18 years ago, I guess maybe even longer than that now, it's almost 20 years, I thought I understood how social transformation worked. And if you read most of these books about how to create social transformation, they all seem they have these absolutes that they advance. And as I got further and further into it, I realized that nothing that I thought was important. Usually the discussion is, how do we get enough money to do this? How do we get the auditorium to hold the conference, to whatever? And the truth, none of those things really matter. It's these 8 laws, which are really sort of philosophical principles. Anyway, the fourth one is the individuals in the group must accept that they may not get either credit or acknowledgement for what they've done and be okay with that. And that's another one of those things. You know, people get mad because they don't feel like they're getting credit or they're being acknowledged. And what you have to do is to work for the thing because of the principle of the thing, not because of your ego. And a lot of people get involved in movements because they think, well, that they'll become prominent. Their ego will get fed by it. The fifth one is each person in the group, regardless of gender, religion, race, or culture, must enjoy fundamental equality, even as the various roles in the hierarchy of the effort are respected. And really what this is saying is we are high-order primates.
Sometimes.
No, we're high-order primates all the time.
Okay.
And high-order and primates organize hierarchically.
Right.
Every primate society, whether it's monkeys or gorillas or people, organize hierarchically.
Right.
That's just the nature of, that's just coded into our genetics.
Yeah.
So you have to recognize that hierarchies emerge in successful groups, but at the same time, you also have to recognize everyone is fundamentally equal. And that just because you may hold a higher position in the group does not mean that you have you are in some special category. I mean, if you listen to during the shutdown by the Trump administration, you heard people like Wilbur Ross or Trump make these astonishingly elitist, oh, you should go to your grocer and tell him he should give you free groceries and you'll settle up when it all gets sorted out.
Or get a bank loan. Sure.
Yeah. Are you just going to get a bank loan? It'll be easy. Or, Ross saying, I don't understand why these people are having any trouble. It's just like a vacation. Well, that's, if you've got $1 billion, that's probably true. But if you're living paycheck to paycheck and couldn't write a check for $400, as is the case with most Americans, then no, that's not true. It's that sense of elitism. So everybody is fundamentally equal, even as you organize. I mean, Martin Luther King or Gandhi, both of them never put on airs. They never became regal in their behavior toward their fellows.
Gandhi wore a loincloth and did his spinning.
Exactly, went quite the opposite direction.
Yeah.
And in fact, that really turns out to be quite important because, for instance, this CEO who now is planning to run, I mean, do we really need another egotistical billionaire to tell us how he's going to run the government? I don't think so. So, or when you recognize that there's this tiny group of people who have as much wealth, 6 people have as much wealth as 48% of the population.
I think it's 28 people.
26 in the world.
Yeah, mostly men. Oxfam's figures.
Same wealth as 3.8 billion people. In the United States, it's just 6.
Oh, okay.
So that kind of inequality sabotages social structure and well-being. So you have to have fundamental equality, but you also have to recognize that we're primates and that we organize hierarchically. So the fifth one is each person in the group, regardless of gender, race, or culture. I already did that with the fifth one. The sixth one is the individuals in the group must forswear violence in act or thought. And that's tough. For me, that was hard. When I was involved with the civil rights movement and I saw policemen with dogs sicking them on women, I confess I had violent thoughts.
Sure.
But you have to give that up. And that's what Gandhi taught his people in the Salt Riot that broke the British Empire's rule of India, is that he trained them as if he was training soldiers. When I was younger, I knew one of the people who was involved with that, and he said he trained us like soldiers in boot camp. And when the day came to do it, and they made this long walk
to the sea,
up to where they were going to do this, 11 people walked forward, and the Indian troops clubbed them to the ground. They all had these kind of like axe handles, clubbed them to the ground, and the women who'd been trained with EMT sort of medicine ran forward and got them and pulled them back and dressed the wounds. And in silence, another 11 people walked forward and got clubbed down. And this went on for several hours until suddenly something changed. And the Indian troops who were doing this to their fellow countrymen looked at each other, and they turned to their British officers and said, "We're not doing this anymore." And that broke the salt tax and broke the British control. So Gandhi was able to get independence for India without a war. And that doesn't happen very often at all. So you have to forswear violence in word, act, or thought. Also, we know from other research that nonviolent social transformational movements succeed 75% of the time.
Yeah, Chenoweth and whatever her name is studies.
And they're more enduring. Violent transformation only succeeds, first of all, about 25% of the time, and it doesn't last very long. I mean, you think about it, National Socialism in Germany really only runs from about 1931 to 1945. Communism, 1915, 1918 to 1991, the end of the Soviet Union. That's a single person's lifetime. So these National Socialist, Communist, these ideological violent movements, they don't last very long in historical terms. Whereas the United States had a revolution, but based its foundation on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and it's lasted 240 years. Anyway, that's a hard one. That was a hard one for me. Law number 7 is the individuals in the group and the group itself must make their private selves consistent with their public postures. And this is where you see, pick any 10 fundamentalist preachers and you can name. You can't be preaching Jesus on one hand and stooping little boys and girls on the other. So who you are in private has to be who you are in public.
But it's interesting that Martin Luther King was a womanizer and a drinker. So somehow humans are so complex that he could be both things, a saint and a sinner.
Well, everybody knew it. He was just an ordinary guy, but he had this, and we can talk about that in a little bit in a second. I got this idea originally from Benjamin Franklin, because Franklin, when he was sent as minister plenipotentiary by the Americans to the court of Louis XVI, when he got over, he got a letter from a woman friend, and she said, "You need to be careful, Dr. Franklin, because your servants, your valet, are almost certainly spies." And in fact, they were. But Franklin wrote back to her and said, "Inasmuch as I say nothing in private that I would scruple to say in public, I don't care if in every other respect my valet is good at his practice. I don't care."
Yeah.
And so you need to, so this idea that your private self and your personal and your public self have to be the same. Also, yes, Dr. King was also a womanizer, as was John Kennedy, as was Franklin. You know, if by womanizer you mean they were not monogamously faithful.
Jefferson.
Well, Jefferson is a more complicated issue because he took up with a woman who looked almost exactly like his wife, was his half-sister, in fact, but he never properly acknowledged her, and he never really, he sent some of her children away, but he was very conflicted. Jefferson, it's not the same.
Sally Hemings.
Yeah, Sally Hemings, of course, is the woman with whom he had children, who was his wife's half-sister. So they had the same father. But the thing about both Franklin and King was that, yes, they did not practice the conservative morality that some people would have liked, but they were decent, compassionate human beings with everybody. And so I think that people recognize the genuineness that both in private and in public, you look at a guy, Jimmy Swaggart, for instance, or Pat Robertson, and their private behavior and their public behavior, not just what they do, but what they say and the essence of their nature. Because it's really about the nature of your character that's the key point here. And then the final law is the individuals in the group and the group collectively must always act from the beingness of life-affirming integrity. That's what I mean by that. You have to be both in private and in public, in essence. You have to be a person who is compassionate, life-affirming, and fostering of well-being. Because that's what creates this real process of change. And you have to do this, as I said earlier, you may not get credit. I mean, one of the most extraordinary stories that very few people seem to know, I mean, when I get interviewed, and almost nobody seems to know this, is that one eccentric transcendentalist, Henry David Thoreau, sitting next to a little pond in Massachusetts, and it is a pond, it's not a big lake.
I've seen it. It was polluted when I saw it.
Yeah, it's just this little pond. Wrote a little monograph, I guess that's what you'd call it. Not really a book, although it's made up as a book, but it's not very long, called Civil Disobedience. And Gandhi, when he was in South Africa, bought a first-class ticket on the railroad. This is how it all got started. He was a barrister, and he was a bit of an Anglophile. I mean, if you look at pictures of his dress at that time, and he was an Anglo-Indian who had adopted a lot of English culture and was a barrister. And he tried to buy a first-class ticket on the train in South Africa, and they wouldn't let him in the car. They made him ride in the third-class car, where what at that time during apartheid was called coloreds, which meant mixed race people, and or non-Caucasian, I guess would be maybe better. Anyway, it really made him angry. He felt affronted and felt he had been disrespected, and so they put him in jail because he made a fuss. And while he was in jail, somehow he got hold of this book, Civil Disobedience, and read it and decided that he would go back to India and get independence from the British in India, and that he would do it using the principles that were described in Thoreau's Civil Disobedience book. Now we skip forward almost another century, really. Well, not anyway, 50 years. And Martin Luther King is this young, anonymous Baptist preacher, AME Baptist preacher in Alabama, and he's offended by the racism that he encounters and the disrespect, and he reads about Gandhi because he's trying to figure out a way to develop a movement that would change that. And he reads about Gandhi, and he reads that Gandhi read this little book that Henry David Thoreau wrote, and he reads it, and he models the civil rights movement on Gandhi and the principles that were in the Thoreau book. Now you think about that for a minute. One eccentric, largely disregarded 19th century transcendentalist living in a little cabin, sitting next to a little pond in Massachusetts, writes a book that changes the course of history for 3 countries: India, Great Britain, and the United States. So you never know when you're doing your share of the work whether that's going to turn out to be absolutely pivotal. You know, you may not think you amount to much, but whatever it is you're doing, whatever it is you're saying may have a huge effect. When I speak to teachers, for instance, I always say to them, you have no idea whether the child in your class, one of the children in your class, is going to be the next Einstein or the next Gandhi or the next Martin Luther King or the next Jane Goodall or whatever. You just, Margaret Sanger, you just don't know. And so your task is not to be specific to particular children, but to be general to all your children about being compassionate, life-affirming, and fostering of well-being.
That's true. So do you have, what do you see in applying the 8 principles to the, as I said, the resistance movement to Trump? Do you think that it's successful? How's it doing?
Well, what strikes me, Gail, is that as of this morning, 39-point-something% of people, 40% if you are considering only registered people, registered voters and people who voted in the last election, then it's 40%.
Approve of Trump, huh?
Approve of Trump.
Yeah.
Still approve of Trump.
Yeah.
And so, but what I do know is that in some other research that has been done, it was done at Van Rensselaer Polytech, they found that in studying transformational movements, I'll get into this again in the 8 Laws of Change at much greater length, they discovered that when 10% of any cohort changes their consciousness, that the whole cohort has to tack to that wind. Mm. And you can see examples of this. I mean, when I was a boy or you were a girl, you went over to somebody's house and on the coffee table there was an ashtray and a pack of cigarettes and a lighter, right?
That was my father. That was my father.
Yeah, you don't see that anymore. Why is that? Nobody passed a law that you couldn't smoke. Nobody, the president didn't go on television and say, we're not going to smoke anymore. What happened was thousands of individuals made a different choice. And as a result, we don't do that anymore. Or another example of this, how quickly it can happen. If you do a Google word search, you know, Google keeps track of how many times people do searches on particular words, and you can get the statistics. If you go back about 3 years, you'll see that you begin to see that they transition from gay to LGBT and then to LGBTQ. Now, again, nobody passed a law. No big public figure stood up and made pronouncements. It's just that when people were writing where they would have written gay, they write LGBT or LGBTQ. And that's not just a change in term, that's a change in your perception of gender. Right. And what gender and sexuality means. Mm-hmm. Or if you look at the Me Too movement that's going on now, something changed about 1.5 years ago, and women just said, that's it, we're not putting up with this anymore. And so out of the result of that is the 2018 Congress. And so these things happen with remarkable rapidity when there is a shift in consciousness. You know, what people, even many scientists, don't really think about properly, I think, culture is a collective intention. It is a collective state of consciousness. You know, different countries may say they belong to the same church, but the community culture about that church is quite different, or education, or sports. You know, football is hugely popular in the United States and virtually unknown in other countries. Not unknown, but just not followed. Whereas they follow soccer, which in the United States has a very small following compared to football. So culture is a result of collective intention and consciousness. And so when you change that, and the research says when 10% of the cohort, whether it's a school group or a nation, changes its consciousness, then the rest, the other 90% of the cohort, have to adapt to that.
You know, there's those transcendental meditation experiments where they, in DC, they prayed, they meditated, and the crime rate went down. But I've never seen any follow-up.
Well, the problem is that I spent 3 years and several $100,000 trying to pursue that. The difficulty is you're talking about a series of experiments that were done based on the Maharishi
right.
Back in the early 80s. They were done really in Atlanta by a couple, but and so I tried to replicate it, and I, boy, put a lot of work into it. I got the Los Angeles Police Department to cooperate with me. They got fully on board. But at the end of the day, you could not, I realized you could not do a meaningful experiment, and all of those experiments were flawed. Because, for instance, the police taught me, based on research that they had done, that if just one black and white police car drives through a neighborhood more than previously or was usually driving through, that crime will go down. They don't have to do anything but drive through the neighborhood. Or, conversely, if a car is parked on a street and the window gets broken and it doesn't get repaired, within 2 weeks, crime will go up. And so you can't, the problem is you can't control
the variables.
And you get false positive or false negative. I went to great lengths. We were going to put people in a neighborhood, and I got a church to agree, and we were going to put them in as the cleaning crew so that nobody would notice them. And you have no idea. It went on. I took about 2 years, and I probably put about $250,000 into it. And in the end of the day, you just couldn't do the experiment because you couldn't control for all the variables. But that said, there is research that shows, for instance, in San Francisco, at the 4 worst schools in the city, schools where the typical school population were kids who either had witnessed physical violence, like a murder, or had been the target of it, or had had a family member who experienced it, where they had a huge dropout rate, all of the problems that you associate with inner city poor schools. They taught them meditation. They didn't call it that. They called it mindfulness, so that they didn't disturb any of the fundamentalist Christians, who aren't really Christians, but that's another story. Anyway, they didn't want to disturb anybody, so they just called it mindfulness training. And they did it every day. And then they tried to stop it. And when they stopped it, the kids revolted and said, no, we've got to have this period. And so every day they had this 20-minute period where the class, all the classes sat in what you and I would call meditation. And what happened was the completion rate went way up, the dropout rate went way down, the violence in school dropped way down, violence in the neighborhoods dropped way down. So yes, if it were in my power to do it, I would have every child starting in about the 3rd grade get taught to meditate.
Why didn't they continue in San Francisco?
Well, when the students revolted, they kept it up. Now, whether they're still doing it, I haven't checked in about 8 months, so I don't know whether they're still doing it. But they published, the people that did the program were so impressed with the results that they published a paper on it. And that's how I found out about it. I read their paper and then followed up and did some more research about it. There's no question that if you can get, if you can get people to develop the daily practice of some form of meditation, it is the best, most important gift you can give yourself. I mean, I would say to you, I've been a daily meditator since 1965, and I consider it one of the most important decisions I ever made.
What form do you use?
Well, I've used all kinds of forms at various times, and then about 25 years ago, when I was running the Mobius Laboratory, and I was really doing a lot of research on meditation, I developed a technique called Meditation for Modern Minds. And it's written in the 8 Laws of Change book because I think it's so important. I made a CD that you can get. You can go up to Amazon or go to my personal website, and you can download it either as a CD or you can just get it online, called Meditation for Modern Minds. And it was a technique of meditation that was based not on religion, but on science. If you think about it, most of the meditation techniques that people use developed centuries or even millennia ago in cultures that were radically different than today. Most people never went more than 5 miles from where they were born. There was no electronic stimulation of telephones and computers and you know, everything else that we have, smartphones. People had very little education, and so the meditations are based on imagery and things that aren't really very relevant to a 21st century person. So I developed this Meditation for Modern Minds technique because it is specifically designed for modern minds, for people who live in the modern world, and it is entirely science-based. But more important than the technique is developing the daily practice. Because we know, for instance, that 11 hours of meditation, cumulatively 11 hours, causes improvement in the prefrontal cortex of your brain. It causes your stress and anxiety to go down. I mean, there are literally thousands of papers about the benefits of meditation. You sleep better, you're more creative, your IQ goes up, you're less stressed, your sex life gets better, your relationships with others get better. I mean, it just goes on and on and on and on. So if there's one thing I tell people, if you really want to change your life, develop the daily practice of meditation. Do it the way I developed or do it some other way. That's not the important part. The important part is that you develop the daily practice. and stick with it. It's quite hard to do for most people because the robots that run most of our lives are very resistant to being reclaimed, which is what happens by meditation.
Are you working on another book?
I'm working on 2 other books.
Are they novels, or what are you working on?
I'm doing a novel, and then I'm starting research on a book called The Deeper Meaning, Science, Religion, and Spiritual Practice.
Tell us more about that one.
Well, I've been doing research on this for quite a long while. If you look at religion and you put aside the dogma and all of that sort of stuff, that's all man-made.
Yeah.
What you end up with is that all religions, regardless of their dogmas, are basically empirical sciences to help people open to non-local consciousness. And all religion begins with one individual who has a non-local consciousness experience. You know, whether it's Jesus in the desert or Mohammed in the cave or Buddha under his tree. What you get is one person has a non-local consciousness experience or experiences, and he or she talks about it. Now, the critical thing that we don't usually understand is that for this to work, it has to be resonant with the culture in which it's being expressed, because otherwise you're just a crank. You know, the difference between a prophet and a crank is that they both may be saying the truth, but the prophet is resonant with his culture or her culture, and the crank is not, and so they just get dismissed. So the foundation of all religions begins with a person who has a non-local consciousness experience, and they talk about it. They have to be charismatic enough that people will listen, and what they say has to be resonant enough with the culture to draw people in and make them pay attention. And then they begin listening to what you're saying, and they write it all down, and sometimes hundreds of years later, and that becomes the scripture. But that's all man-made. They just want to strip all that away, all the man-made stuff away, and just stick with what the dynamic of spiritual practices and religion is about. So then what happens? Then people start gathering at a place. There's the place, whether it's a temple or a shrine or a synagogue or a church or an Etruscan oak grove. It doesn't make any difference. There's the place where you gather. And that matters because we know from research that when a place becomes the target of intention-focused awareness, it becomes more numinous. It becomes informationally enriched in the non-local, and so it's perceived as sacred.
Or resonant.
Yeah, resonant. So you have the place. Then you have, when you gather at the appointed time, you have a statement of common intention. So if you're a Christian, it's the Nicene Creed. If you're a follower of voodoo, it's the voodoo practitioner. If you're a Jew or a Muslim, it's a statement of common intention framed in that culture. So and why does this matter? Because it's creating common intention. Mm-hmm. And it also begins the process of brain entraining. Mm. There is a whole branch of neuroscience that was begun by a neuroscientist named Andrew Newberg called neurotheology. And what he discovered was when people chant or dance or sing or drum together, their brains become entrained. And that means that you reach a point where you can express common intention. Then there is then there's teachings, but that's all the man-made stuff again. But then there is a period of time during which some, but not all, of the members of the group at least have the potential to have a non-local consciousness experience. Mm. You sit in prayer, you have speaking in tongues, you have prophecy, you have healing ceremonies. Those are ways of allowing some, but not all, you never know who, to have an experience, a non-local consciousness experience, which is expressed, which for the group validates that they're doing the right thing and believe the right thing. And then you get the recommitment to gather again at the next appointed time. So if you look at religious services, religious rituals, the places where they occur, and then you can look at, for instance, the role of water and wine. We know, I did a series of experiments that showed that when you focus intentioned awareness on water, you change its molecular structure in an objectively measurable way.
It bonds differently.
It changes the bonding relationship, yes. In the case of wine, we haven't done that particular experiment, although that may also be what's happening with wine, but there's something else that happens with wine. In the Christian faith, it's transubstantiation. That is, it's transformed by the intentioned awareness of the priest who's blessing it. And what actually happens is that there is a change in the aesthetic, subjective appreciation of the wine. I did research in which I took the same bottle of wine, split it in two, had meditators focus on one half of the bottle, not on the other half, and then had people taste it, telling them it was two different kinds of wine and asking them which wine was better. And overwhelmingly, they picked the wine that was the focus of the meditators who had focused on it before the tasting.
That was when you were in Virginia, one of your early experiments.
Yes, one of my early experiments. And so there are many others. Dean Radin did a series of experiments where he was looking at tea and chocolate. And the same basic idea, take a pound of tea, split it into two, have meditators focus on one half of the pound and not on the other, and then make tea out of it, and then ask people, how do you feel? Or chocolate, same thing. But it's even more than that. It's literally the scriptures, the letters in which the scriptures are written. The attention-focused awareness. There's research that shows that intention-focused awareness, literally on the words themselves, changes at the non-local level people's appreciation of it. An early study, for instance, Gary Schwartz, no relation, did a study in which he had Hebrew words and then fake Hebrew words, and he asked people questions about them, and he found that the words that were the real Hebrew words always rated higher than the fake Hebrew words. And these were people who didn't know anything about Hebrew. They just were looking at writing. Or Swibert Ertel, a German researcher, did the same thing using Japanese glyphs, in which some were real and some were not, and they could tell the difference. They didn't think of them as real or not real, but they gave, in answer to his questions, they always chose the real words from the fake words, or sometimes he presented them upside down or right side up, and when he presented them upside down, then they got a lower score than when he presented them right side up. So it literally goes into the words, because what all of this is about is changing the informational structure in non-local consciousness, in the non-local domain. And so acts of intentioned awareness alter the informational structure. And religions are essentially empirically developed protocols, as we call them in science, call them rituals in religion, but they're protocols that are designed to allow people to experience non-local consciousness.
Now that young people are consistently less religious in the U.S., less likely to go to church, do you think maybe music and concerts replaces religion for them in providing some of that luminosity?
Well, that's what makes concerts attractive, because it focuses everybody's attention. You're paying attention to whomever the artist is that you've come to listen to. And so it's that shared, linked consciousness that's what gives everybody that sense of increased numinosity, increased emotional content. You come out of concerts and, oh, how meaningful it was, because you have shared a common experience, and it has caused this brain entraining that Newberg is talking about. And is that going to replace it? No, I'm hoping that out of the ecological movement and out of these various social movements will come an awareness of the importance of developing disciplines of intention-focused awareness like meditation. Because it has to develop some kind of coherence that extends from time to time. It's not just a one-off like a concert. It's this recurring recommitment, because that's how the 8 laws get expressed. And I think it's not clear. I don't think it's clear yet. I don't think it's clear yet whether we're going to survive as a civilization. I would, if pressed, I would say by 2100. I'm not sure. We're certainly not going to live in a world that's remotely like the world we're living in now. We're going to have millions of, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of climate refugees, for instance.
Right.
We're going to see the massive disruption of cities. We're going to have in the United States, we're going to have 3 major migrations: away from the coasts because of sea rise, out of the Southwest because of lack of water and temperature increase, and out of the central states because of violent climactic events like tornadoes. So I'm not sure the United States is going to survive. I would say I'd give it about a 60-40, 60 being it won't survive. Now, the forms may survive. That is, we may maintain the form of federal government, but I think real power, because we're not doing anything about climate change, real power is going to devolve to bioregions, and states are going to realign themselves because they have certain common problems and are going to have to solve them in common.
Or their resources give them power or something.
Yeah, I mean, like, I live in the Pacific Northwest. I think Cascadia, which is going to be a region from Northern California up to the Canadian border, is going to become much more important than the political borders. Already, Washington State, where I live, for instance, it's really 2 states. It's Cascadia, that's west of the Cascade Mountains, liberal, inclusive, religiously tolerant, democratic. It's a blue area. The east side is much more, is a red value, fundamentalist, racist, gun-oriented, all of that. So as time goes along, as a result of the extreme changes that climate change is going to create, people are going to organize, I think, They may maintain the forms, but the real power is going to devolve down to these bioregions where because they have common problems and have to design common solutions.
You know, there was an old novel called Ecotopia about
Yes.
about kind of this kind of situation.
Yes, I think that actually Ecotopia, I remember reading it very well. Ecotopia was in many ways a precognition of what I think is coming.
Yeah.
Because you can already see this happening between, say, Mississippi and California. I mean, we laugh. I mean, everybody says, well, no, there is none. These red value states, I mean, one of the things that's becoming clearer and clearer year by year, you can see it in Kansas, you can see it in Michigan, you can see it in Wisconsin. Red value governance doesn't work. It produces degradation of social well-being. And the only reason that it's able to survive at all is that the blue value states underwrite the failure of the red value states. I mean, for instance, Mississippi puts $1 of taxes in and takes $3 in benefits out. California puts $1 in, takes 78 cents out. So at some point, the states that are doing the underwriting of the failed states, when pressed by their own problems, California's sea rise, for instance, just are going to look at that and say, why are we continuing to fund the idiocy of these red value states and the way they govern?
But on the other hand, we have like Stacey Abrams almost won in Georgia, Beto O'Rourke almost won against Cruz in Texas. So there are these little glimmerings of progressive thinking even in those blue states.
In those red states. What's
red
happening
states.
is the population is changing.
Hispanic, black.
Well, blacks, Hispanics are moving into Texas in increasing numbers. We are going to become, it depends on which statistician you're reading, but somewhere about 2048, we're going to become a majority-minority country.
And we are already with youth.
Yeah, well, yes, with youth and in some states, or California.
Texas.
So what's happening is, what's causing the problem is that the sort of white fundamentalists, the Republican Party has become a party basically of white fundamentalists. And I think of them as Christo-fascists.
That's good.
They're terrified.
Yes.
Because the world is changing in ways that they find discommoding. They feel a loss of status. I mean, if you read, I spend a fair amount of time reading this right-wing literature, and what you get is their fear of loss of status, fear that your get-out-of-jail card is going to go away, fear of loss of privilege, and most of all, fear that women will be equal.
And that's why the abortion issue is so important to them. It's just a symbol of a way to control women, don't you think?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The abortion movement is not about saving unborn fetuses.
Because they don't care about babies.
No, if they cared about babies, then they would be very actively promoting prenatal care, child care, maternal care,
school lunches,
education, school lunch, all the stuff that makes children prosper. They don't support any of that. It's all about it's all the Abrahamic thinking, Middle Bronze Age thinking. That's the curse of all the Abrahamic religions. Judaism, Christianity, Islam. The curse of all of them is that Abrahamic thought in the Middle Bronze Ages when these religions, I mean, they didn't all begin then, but they were all shaped by this, was developed by nomadic tribes, and when they traveled around in tents, it became very important to control women because bloodlines were the way that the hierarchy was created. And as one Orthodox Jewish woman told me one time, you always know who the mother is. So you don't know who the father is necessarily, but you always know who the mother is. So, for instance, I didn't know this, but this was years ago. I spoke at I was asked to speak at a conference of Orthodox Jews about whom I knew almost nothing. And so I gave this talk, and afterwards this group of women came up to me and said, you don't get it. At this point, Judaism is passed through the mother, not the father. Why? Because you have to know who the mother is. And you always know who the mother is. And the other is, I think there is an existential issue, and that is all men recognize that the only way to get into incarnation is through the body of a woman. And so the whole Adam's rib thing is really an ego compensation for the fact that men can't do it.
Karen Horney was a neo-Freudian who talked about womb envy.
Yeah. I mean, the only way you can get into, but this obsession with controlling women, which is what's really the abortion movement is about,
yeah,
and how sadly a lot of women have bought into this and are leaders in it.
Right.
But then you have to recognize that for a lot of people, a lot of women, being subordinate and submissive is safe. It makes you feel safer. I mean, you read the psychological studies, you talk to these women that are in these movements, and it makes them feel more secure and safer, somebody's going to take care of me.
They're protected.
Yeah, exactly. So, but all of that is coming into crisis now, and that's these young people who are falling away from the churches. If you look at, about, I guess it's almost 2 years now, about 2 years ago, when I started to write novels, I did it for the same reason. I went to I spoke at a conference that was mostly made up of millennials and younger. And afterwards, a group of them took me out to lunch. And as I was speaking to them, I made a reference to Barbara Tuchman. They'd never heard of her. And then, just to test my idea, I mentioned David McCullough, and they'd never heard of him either. So I said to them, well, what is it you read? And they said, well, we read novels, we read adult graphics,
yeah,
we play video games,
yeah,
we watch television series on Netflix and things, Stars and Showtime. So I came back from that and thought,
I got to write a novel.
I got to write novels, and because I can get the same information that I put into all my science papers based on my research, I'll just put it in a novel form. And so I wrote Awakening. That was the first one, a novel of aliens and consciousness. And then the second one was The Vision, a novel of time and consciousness. And I'm just about to publish a third one which is the second in the series, again, because they like series, The Vision. So the second book, that's the first volume of the Michael Gillespie Mysteries. And the second volume, The Amish Girl, is just about to come out, and it's a continuation of the Vision. So, Awakening, The Vision, and now The Amish Girl are the novel books, and then I'm starting another nonfiction book, which is really a continuation in a way of the 8 Laws of Change, which is a nonfiction, and that's about religion and spiritual practices, because you can take the dogma part away, and you get the principles under which they're operating, and that's applicable to all sorts of things.
Well, when you write novels, how much of it is irrational, I want to say, is not you just think, I'm going to do this, this is the plot structure, this character has this conflict with so-and-so. How much of it writes itself? The character takes over and says, this is what I'm doing, Stephen, forget it.
Oh, well, I can't speak for everybody, I can only speak for myself about this. When you create a world, you create its rules. And you people it with figures, and you create their rules. And you have to follow. You can't suddenly have a person who's an idiot have suddenly become a genius. I mean, that's just an example. You have to explain. And some novels are mostly about explaining transition. So you can't have a man who is, for instance, a bully and a woman abuser suddenly become a different kind of person. He can change, but you have to explain what is the basis for his change. So once you set it in motion, you have to be consistent. You can't just suddenly make him a different thing. You have to explain how he got to be a different thing. And if you think about it, a lot of novels are about just that part, just that little piece. How did a person who started out this way become that way? In my novels, I'm giving out a lot of information about how consciousness works. And so, and I like adventures, and so they're sort of adventure stories. Awakening is about a senior Senate staffer who comes to believe that an alien is being held at a secret facility and what he does about that. The Vision is about if you and I and a few other people, we all lived close together, and we thought that in 3 weeks there was going to be a nuclear bomb go off to destroy the city where we lived. What would you do? So it's about what people do.
That's interesting.
So when I set the world up and I set the characters up who are in that world, they have to follow their rules, or you have to explain why they changed the rules, because they can change. But that has to become part of the story. You just can't arbitrarily do it.
But are you ever surprised at how they evolve because it didn't come from your conscious mind?
Oh, yes, all the time. I mean, because you don't know. When I start telling the story, I mean, I tell these stories, a lot of them are based on actual experiences that I've had. So I know exactly how things happen. But that's what happened to me. If I put my character in that's what happened, I know what's going to happen in terms of exterior things, but the interior experience of the person has to be consistent with the personality that I've set up. And so, absolutely. I mean, I'll be writing along and I'll suddenly realize, well, that person couldn't do that. That would be completely inconsistent. So if I want them to do that, then how could they possibly, what has to happen to change them? So that's a whole section you got to write you didn't have any idea about. So you're creating a world and people in that world, and some of it you can control, some of it you can set up in advance, but a great deal of it, as you work it out, as you work out how this is going to happen, no, you don't know. You have to, the Amish Girl, for instance, is based on a true story about an Amish girl that disappeared, and I was asked to find her, find out what happened to her. Nova made a program, included it in one of their programs, because the district attorney was willing to go on camera and say this, they were able to solve this. These are about remote viewing. But when I wrote it, when I actually did the experiment or did the task, I never met the person who committed this act, and I only knew a few things about him. And that was because the remote viewers told me about him, and it turned out to be true. So, but I never met him, and I didn't really know very much about him. So when I went to write the novel, I had to think, well, given these parameters, what would that person be like? And why would he have the kind of attitudes that he's got? What made him the way he is? And so I had to create a whole life story for him. And as I went along, I mean, basically he said to me, "No, I can't do that. I have to do this." Or I wouldn't say that. I would say this. You can't make an inarticulate person suddenly articulate, because that's not what happens. So if I wanted to make him say something, if I wanted the plot to move along in a certain way, I had to figure out how that person would behave and what they would say and do in that situation. So yeah, I like writing novels.
Neat. Are you still working with your remote viewers about 2050? And I'm wondering what kind of feedback you're getting.
I am, in fact, as we speak, I am just beginning a new project to look at 2060.
Well, what did they say about 2050?
Oh, the 2050 people were, from 1978 to 1996, I interviewed about 4,000 people. Whew. And every major thing they consensually told me. Now, not everybody gets everything right. Not everybody sees everything. You're looking for consensus. The consensual perceptions, everything they told me about getting to 2050, we're not there yet, getting to 2050, has turned out to be true.
Like what?
Well, they said to me, for instance, I got started in this in 78 because I was part of the MIT discussion group on Secretary of Defense, MIT discussion group on innovation, technology, and the future, and was in a similar group with the Smithsonian. And so I met all these futurists, and I knew what they thought was going to happen. But I was also involved with geopolitical strategy. I was special assistant to Chief of Naval Operations. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about what are the geopolitical, military, strategic issues that are going on. And at that time, 78, most of us thought there was going to be a nuclear war. Even was in the popular media, The Day After Tomorrow, for instance, or On the Beach, were popular, big best-selling books or films at the time. So a lot of us who were involved with doing long-range projection were really concerned that we were going to have a nuclear exchange. And we got so close, the Cuban Missile Crisis, everybody knows about that, but very few people know that one Russian colonel stopped a nuclear war because he wouldn't push the button.
Because there was a tech error or something?
Yeah, radar was giving him a tech error, but he didn't know it was a tech error.
Right.
He just decided that, no, I don't think the Americans would do that, and he wouldn't push the button.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, we did not have a nuclear exchange that destroyed civilization.
Wow.
Russia and the United States. So that was a really, I mean, mutually assured destruction was the strategic geopolitical strategy of the day. The idea was that if both sides had so many nuclear bombs, nobody would attack the other one because everybody would get destroyed in the process. So mutually assured destruction, MAD it was called. So anyway, I came out in '78 and really concerned about that. And I started doing these remote viewings. And they said, oh, no, there's not a nuclear exchange. And I said, oh, well, then the world must be much safer. And the remote viewers said, no, it's much more dangerous. And I said, why? And they said, because of terrorism. Well, in 1978, terrorism was not big on the
radar.
Everybody's awareness, you know. I mean, there were IRA and between Britain and the IRA, and there were others, you know, the Palestinians and the Jews, Israelis. But terrorism as a massive threat, no, didn't exist. So I thought, terrorism? Really? They said, oh, yes, this is going to become a huge deal. I said, well, what happens with the Soviet Union? And they said, oh, it disappears. And I thought, what, aliens come down and rip the land and take it away with all the people? What do you mean it disappears? And they said to me, well, I don't know, but it doesn't exist anymore.
Wow, that's really predictive.
Yeah, and so, I mean, I said, well, talking about healthcare, they said, oh, well, there's going to be a series of epidemics. I said, really? What kind of epidemics? I was thinking of the 1918 Spanish flu. Which killed millions of people.
Yeah.
And said to me, no, the first one will be a blood disease that crosses over from primates to humans in Africa and is brought into the United States.
That's really specific. That's really specific.
Absolutely. So I went to a friend of mine who was one of the leaders of the National Institutes of Health, happened to be a hematologist, and said to him, do you know anything about a blood disease? This is 79, this started. Do you know anything about a blood disease that's going to come out of Africa and kill millions of people? And he said, no, Stephen, I don't know where you got that, but that's science fiction. And of course, 1981, the first AIDS cases began to emerge and 35 million people were killed. The collapse of antibiotic medicine. They said to me when I talked to them about, I want you to go to a hospital and describe to me what's going on. And they said, well, they don't use antibiotics much anymore. And I said, why not? And they said, well, they don't work. And of course, nobody thought about such a thing. Or they said climate change. That was another really big one.
Oh, yeah.
I asked people, go and describe for me, go particular. If I was in a particular city, I'd say, well, tell me, what Virginia Beach is going to be like in 2050. And they would say to me, well, for one thing, the beach, the parking lot will be underwater. And all the motels will be underwater. And I said, why? And they said, oh, well, because the sea level has risen so much. Oh, why? What are you talking about?
Wow.
I didn't know anything about climate change. The first paper I read on climate change was 1991 in American Scientist. And talking about ice coring. That was the first time I ever heard about climate change. And by then, I had this description of these people that I now recognize as climate change. They called them earth changes, really, mostly. Oh, yeah, well, there's these huge earth changes. Oh, really? What is that like? What happens? Oh, well, people don't live. I was in Phoenix once and doing this. And they said to me, oh, well, there aren't very many people in Phoenix anymore. Why? Well, it's too hot, and there's no water. And I said, well, what do you mean too hot? Oh, well, you can't go out. It would kill you to go out and stay out all day. Well, I had been in Egypt working with the Bedouin to dig at archaeological sites, and I knew that at 114 degrees, the Bedouin quit work and went into their tents. They wouldn't work. So 114, the people couldn't go out and be outdoors. Well, that meant it was more than 114. Now, of course, they're talking about maybe as many as 150 days a year when it'll be above 114. And the Colorado River is simply not going to be able to provide water, and the lakes, Lake Mead, and they're all drying up. In fact, when I was writing my first book, The Secret Vaults of Time, I used to take my daughter fishing at a lake called Lake Mary, which is up above Flagstaff. And I was there a couple of years ago, and I went out to the place to see where my daughter and I had fished. We never caught anything. Catching fish and fishing are different things. That just gave me time to spend with my daughter.
Yeah.
And the lake isn't completely dried up.
Mm.
The Salton Sea. I remember when I lived in L.A. and was running Mobius, we'd go down to the Salton Sea, and it was this kind of quirky, sort of hippie commune kind of place, and well, it's mostly gone now. It's dried up. So the thing that, however, that's important to remember is that none of this is predestined. When you ask people to do precognitive tasks, what you're asking them to do is to read the highest probability of that target future at the moment that they are providing the information, but it's not fixed. It's not predestination. So I want to do the 2060 one to see what the difference between 2050 and 2060 are, and what the choices that we've made since 1996, what those choices have done to our future.
So interesting. I want to ask you, because the book is shaping up to be about creating a new scientific non-materialist paradigm. And you, in an article in Subtle Energies, did a good job of defining what this is. And so maybe I could just say, and you could explain what you mean. There's 5 traits of subtle energies and energy medicine, you said. Only certain aspects of the mind are the result of physiologic processes. So in other words, the mind isn't just based in the physical.
Yes, that's right. Physicalism, materialism is a worldview that developed because science and consciousness were severed in the 16th century Council of Trent. The church took anything that had to do with consciousness as its area, and it gave to science things that were space-time, physical. And because there was lots to do, scientists were mostly okay. And they knew that if you violated the taboo, you'd get killed and tortured, burned alive. And it went on for hundreds of years. I mean, the last person killed by the Inquisition was in the mid-19th, or first third of the 19th century, 1826, was a Spanish teacher who was teaching his students about deism, of all things.
So God in everything.
And he was publicly garroted.
Wow.
For that. So it wasn't until the 19th century, for about 400 years, science had nothing to say about consciousness. Now, certain individuals did, but as a proposition, science didn't. Until the 19th century, when psychology, psychiatry, and parapsychology all contemporaneously developed.
Like William James.
William James, sure, yeah. Crookes, Frederick Myers, Charles Richet, Stanislaus Poniatowski, all these researchers got interested at the early part of the 20th century, wore collier, and were recognized that science was incomplete and needed to make consciousness a fundamental. And we're still struggling with that. The dominant paradigm is still physicalist materialist. The fact that that's completely inconsistent with the actual experimental data, physicalists, the way they deal with it is the same way anti-evolutionists deal with evolution. They just ignore the research. Or creationists, you know, the world is 6,000 years old. I mean, you can say, well, that's an absurd position, but there are lots of people still believe that, including lots of people in Congress. That is a fundamental belief of fundamentalism, that, you know, the world was created in 6 days, and then God rested on the seventh, and Adam, the rib of Adam became Eve, and, you know, all of that stuff. I mean, the fact that it's complete nonsense doesn't make any difference, because that's what they believe. And so when you talk to people who are physicalists and you say to them, well, what about this research or that research? They've never bothered to read it. They just have an attitude about it. It's all about attitude.
But quantum physics, quantum mechanics has really changed it all because of non-local effects and the observer effect. So quantum physics has got to change the paradigm, right?
Well, it's more complicated than that. Quantum mechanics appears to have something to do with this, but exactly what is unclear. I would prefer, I don't talk a lot about quantum mechanics because everything I talk about is based on experimental data. And experimental data is very unclear. The only person that has even attempted specifically to test quantum ideas is Dean Radin with his double slit experiments. I prefer to talk about information because I think that what we are dealing with is an information phenomena and the continuity of consciousness. The research is very clear, I think, if anybody that actually bothers to take time to look at it, that consciousness pre-exists incarnation and it continues to exist after corporeal death, and that episodically this eternal self, what religion calls the soul, manifests other personalities. You're not coming back, I'm not coming back. But that the eternal part of us, the soul part of us, if you will manifest additional personalities. And what comes across from earlier incarnations is information. And that has an effect on your DNA and even has an effect on your birthmarks and wound tissue that you may be born with.
Ian Stevenson showed that with his kids. Yeah. Exactly.
Ian Stevenson and now Jim Tucker. There's a very interesting book, Biology and Reincarnation, that you ought to read, and the evidence suggests, as I say, that what we're looking at is an information phenomenon, what Jung called noumena.
Or the collective unconscious?
Well, of course, yes. I mean, the idea of the collective unconscious begins with a guy named Adolf Bastian in the 19th century, who wrote a book called The Psychic Unity of Mankind and described what he called the elementary thoughts of humanity. That had a huge effect on the early German physicists who were the fathers of modern physics, Pauli, Planck, Einstein, Schrödinger, Heisenberg. Jung, that had a big influence on them. And it also influenced Jung. It's where he got the idea for the collective unconscious. Oh. It's where Joe Campbell got the idea for the monomyth. It's the idea that these informational architectures exist in the non-local domain that are created by multiple acts of intention-focused awareness. and that they create memes that shape culture. So what we're dealing with is an information phenomena. The big mystery question for me, I don't have an answer, is what is information?
Right.
And I don't know anybody that knows the answer to that. God knows I have certainly asked everybody I could think of and read everything I could read on the subject. People have all kinds of things that define how information operates, but what is it? Nobody knows.
Some people talk about an information field.
Yeah, I know, but a field requires a spatiality.
Yeah.
So if you're outside of time, space, there's no spatiality. So it's information structure is as best I can do, and even that has problems. It's more like doing a Google search. You know, you do a query based on certain words and you find information structures. So that's not a great metaphor, but it's the best one I know. The most interesting part of physics right now that I'm following is information theory, because they're at least struggling with trying to figure out what information is. But in any case, we're looking at information that is manipulated by intentioned focused awareness. That Max Planck, the father of quantum mechanics, is correct when he says consciousness is causal and fundamental. You can't get behind consciousness. Space-time arises from consciousness, not consciousness from space-time. That, by the way, is my very elderly black pussycat who has suddenly stood up.
I didn't see her.
Oh, well, I guess you can't see him. Well, anyway, he's standing up.
Oh, so that's your second definition. Consciousness is causal. Physical reality is its manifestation. And then the third one is all consciousness is part of the network of life. And there's a passage back and forth between the individual and the collective. So yes, we're part of the network.
Yes, it's the matrix of life. We live in an informational matrix that is manipulated by consciousness. And and the research about this is just overwhelming. There are at least, gosh, at this point, maybe 10 or 12 protocols that each have odds that they are happening by chance of greater than 1 in a billion. It's just people don't pay attention to it because it doesn't fit their attitude.
What's an example of one of those protocols?
Oh, remote viewing is one example. Let's see, Gansfeld. That's a kind of remote viewing. Therapeutic intention, healing. That's one. Presentiment. That's studies that show that you're staring at a screen, and just a few seconds before the image appears on the screen, your eyes dilate. And if the image is violent or sexual, it evokes a big emotional response, your eyes dilate more. Golly, what else?
The amazing thing to me is that remote viewers were as accurate about a target that hadn't been selected until after they defined it. So you didn't even need to have them look at something that was in the present.
Yes, we discovered that it's just as easy to describe something in the present as it is something that lies in the future. Again, what they're describing is a probability, but because you're in a very limited time sequence with a very specific sequence of acts that happen. I mean, a typical remote viewing in a lab today would be, Gail, I'm going to show you a picture in an hour. I have no idea what it is. In fact, it hasn't even been selected yet. It won't be selected until after you give me the information, and it'll be selected with no reference to your information. It'll just be selected by a computer out of a big pool of targets. And so could you please describe it for me? Well, what you're actually describing is a probability, but because the time frame, an hour, and because of the commitment to, I'm going to show it to you, the computer's already programmed, all of those factors virtually assure that it's 100%. Now, it's true that the target that you describe, if the building suddenly blew up, you might not, I mean, you could change the probability, but in most cases, it doesn't get changed. And so...
now I see him.
Yeah, that's Panger Ban. He's 21 years old.
All right.
And he sleeps in front of my monitor. I think it's warm.
Mine does too. She just wants me to pet her occasionally.
Yeah, I think he does too. Anyway.
So are you able to do remote viewing yourself?
Yes, of course. Yeah, me personally?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
Do you use it in your life, like to say, should I do this or should I do that? I'm going to remote view the outcome of this or that?
Yes, sometimes. More often, I take things into meditation, and I ask that I allow myself to open up to the options that are available to me, and that I'm able to identify the one that is the most compassionate and life-affirming. Because if you really want to change the world, go back to the 8 laws, as we're coming to an end, the key to it is what I call the quotidian choice. Every day, you make hundreds of choices. You just don't think of that. The toothpaste you buy, the soap you buy, the food you buy, the gas you buy, the movies you go to, the television shows you watch, all of those are choices. And so you make this commitment. If you want to change the world, this is how you do it. Every day I have lots and lots of choices. Of the options that are available to me, I commit to always pick the one that is the most compassionate, life-affirming, and fostering of well-being. Now, none of the choices may be good, but inevitably, even when they aren't good, one is always better, slightly, than the others. And so you always default to the most compassionate, life-affirming, and fostering of well-being choice. And in that, you tell 10 people that you're doing this, and you invite them to join you in doing this and to tell 10 of their friends. And if that were to happen, the people that are listening to your podcast could change the course of history.
Yes. You say that change isn't evolutionary, it's revolutionary. Could you explain that?
Well, you can create change not as an evolutionary process, but by choosing something quite different. Again, you go back to the abolitionists, not making, you could have argued, oh, well, slaves ought to get better housing, and we ought to, as a society, lobby that they get better food and housing. They're still slaves.
Yeah.
But their conditions are better. That's an evolutionary change.
Oh, wait. Look.
Oh, yes. Okay. Well, Mr. Band's gone back to sleep, so I won't. But a revolutionary change is we got to stop slavery.
Yeah.
Or an evolutionary change would be, well, women don't get to vote, but every husband is required to consult his wife and get her input before he votes.
Okay.
That's evolutionary change.
Yeah.
Revolutionary change is women should get the right to vote. So real change like that is based on creating well-being. I have what I call the theorem of well-being. And the theorem of well-being says, if you do the quotidian choice thing I'm describing, where you always choose the option that is the most compassionate, life-affirming, and fostering of well-being, it will create a change that reflects those choices you and other people make. And what you discover when you look at those changes is they are always, I have never found a contradiction. Now, maybe there is one, but I haven't found it. The theorem of well-being says changes which are compassionate, life-affirming, and fostering of well-being are always easier to implement, more efficient, more productive, nicer to live under, longer lasting, and much, much cheaper. Whenever you hear some politician in the United States say, we can't afford universal health care, we can't afford to give everybody free health care, well, you're not giving them free health care. Nobody gives free health care. What they do is the state, the society, as a society decides that health care is in the interest of society, and so it allocates resources so that everybody gets health care without being financially drained. So when people tell you we can't afford it, you look at the rest of the developed world. Every other developed country in the world has been able to get universal health care.
And they spend much less.
Without exception, pay much, much less
and
than we do.
better outcomes.
So whenever you hear some politician tell you we can't afford to give universal health care, what you're hearing is either a liar or a moron or a lying moron. All right. Well, thank you, dear.
Wait. Right. The fifth one is the ultimate goal of organic evolution cannot now be scientifically defined.
Just what that says.
So what else might it be?
Well, I think, I hope, that it is an evolution into recognizing that consciousness is the fundamental and causal, and that we create human society which has as its first priority well-being. I'm not against profit. I'm only against profit that is unrestrained, because profit should always be subordinate to well-being.
We could go on. I could go on, but I will let you go. Thank you so much. This is so informative.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. You have a good day.
You too. It's going to be a good book.
Okay. You take care now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.